In the quiet stillness of a stormy dusk, a weary farmer cradles his trembling horse, singing an old lullaby to soothe its fear, unaware that just beyond the fence line a stranger listens, tears in his eyes, with a contract in his coat pocket that could change everything. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The land was tired, cracked open like parched lips begging for rain that never came. Rows of corn leaned like drunks at the end of a long night, stalks yellowed and brittle, too weak to stand proud anymore. The dust hung in the air long after Henry's boots passed through it, clinging to his jeans, his lungs, his spirit. The sky above stretched wide and useless, blue, empty, mocking. Henry stood at the edge of the field with a hand on his hip and the other shading his eyes, though there wasn't much sun to block. Just heat, heavy and cruel, pressing down like a secret he couldn't shake. He stared out at what used to be good land, his father's land, and his father's before that. The soil that once fed towns now couldn't feed a bird. The silence was broken only by the faint creak of the windmill behind the barn, spinning just enough to remind him it still existed, still hadn't given up, unlike the crops. His lips tightened. He didn't speak, not even to curse. What was the point? The words would dry up in his throat just like everything else on this damn farm. Back in the house, the stack of bills waited. He knew them by color now. White envelopes meant late notices. Pink ones meant trouble. Yellow meant shut-off. He'd stopped opening them. They were just reminders that the world had already made its decision about him, and it wasn't in his favor. He reached down, scooped a handful of dirt, and let it run through his fingers. It didn't even clump, just dry, dead powder. He hated how it felt, like failure. Inside the barn the horses stirred. He could hear Dolly shifting her weight, restless. She was the only one left now. He'd sold the others months ago. Quiet deals with quiet men who didn't ask questions. That mare was all he had left, that breathed and trusted him. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand and looked toward the barn. His legs felt like cement, but he forced himself forward. Another day, another dollar deeper in the hole, and still he kept walking. Because giving up wasn't something his father had ever taught him. The kitchen was quiet except for the ticking clock on the wall and the slow drip of the faucet that never quite sealed shut. The kind of quiet that didn't offer peace, just a reminder that nothing was moving forward. Henry sat hunched over the table, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, a black pen clutched in his calloused fingers. His boots were still on, mud dried along the soles like he hadn't really come inside, just paused between battles. A yellow bulb above buzzed faintly, casting a sickly glow over the scattered papers in front of him, electric bills, feed invoices, tractor repairs he couldn't afford but couldn't delay. His own scrawl lined the margins, numbers crossed out, rewritten, circled again. The math didn't change. No matter how many times he ran it, it always ended the same, less than zero. He scratched behind his ear, sighing through his nose, then pressed the tip of the pen against the column of digits as if he could will them to shrink. Maybe if he rounded down, maybe if the rain came, maybe if the engine held out one more season. The maybes didn't make a dent. The silence broke with the sharp snap of him tossing the pen across the table. It skidded, hit a coffee cup, and fell to the floor. He didn't flinch, just sat back, ran a hand down his face, and stared at the ceiling like he was trying to make a deal with it. God hadn't answered in a while. He reached for a nearly empty jar of instant coffee. No sugar, no milk, just something hot to keep the night from swallowing him whole. The spoon clinked inside the mug, and he stirred until the water turned brown, took a sip, bitter like everything else. A photo frame sat half-hidden behind a pile of past-due notices. Henry pulled it forward, him and his wife, years ago, both laughing in a way that didn't seem possible now. He traced her face with his thumb. "I'm trying, Anna," he said, voice low and cracking. "God knows I'm trying." Outside, the wind howled against the walls, and somewhere in the barn, Dolly let out a restless nicker. He looked toward the window, jaw tight. Another sleepless night. Another ledger that wouldn't balance. And still, morning would come, whether he was ready or not. The first crack of thunder came low and distant, like the growl of something waking up. Henry didn't look up from his place by the sink, where he was scrubbing the same plate for the third time. But then the second one hit harder, sharp, rolling through the valley with a sound that made the windows rattle in their frames. His hand froze mid-scrub. Outside, the wind was rising fast. Tree branches clawed at the side of the house, and the old screen door groaned on its hinges. A dry storm. No rain yet, just noise and fury, the worst kind. The kind that didn't bring relief, only fear. Then he heard it. A sharp, frantic thudding, hooves on wood, fast. Wild. Henry dropped the plate. It shattered in the sink. He was out the door before the shards had stopped rattling. The barn loomed in the dark, the sky above it pulsing with flashes of white. Lightning lit the whole world for a second at a time, and in those bursts he could see Dolly rearing in her stall, eyes wide, nostrils flared, her coat slick with sweat. She slammed her hooves against the gate again hard enough to shake the walls. The sound of it cut through him. "Easy, girl, easy," he shouted, already fumbling with the latch. The storm was overhead now, thunder crashing like it had something to prove. Dolly shrieked, a high, panicked sound Henry hadn't heard since the accident, 2 summers back when she'd nearly broken her leg. She reared again and nearly toppled over. He slipped inside the stall and caught her halter just before she bolted. She jerked back, wild-eyed, but he held on. His arms trembled with the effort. Hey, it's all right," he whispered, pulling her close. His voice was hoarse, shaking. "I got you." She pushed her head into his chest, snorting and twitching. Every time the thunder clapped, she flinched. He started to hum, then sing. Not because he thought it would work, but because he didn't know what else to do. His voice, rough and low, stumbled through the old lullaby his mother used to sing when the lights went out. And slowly, inch by inch, Dolly's breathing began to slow. Still trembling, still afraid, but her ears turned toward him now. Outside, the storm raged. But inside the stall, a man and his horse clung to the only thing they had left, each other. The words came slow, cracked from a place deep in his chest, like they'd been buried there a long time. He hadn't sung in years, not since Anna passed, not since the last of the joy dried up with the crops. But in that moment, kneeling beside a shaking, terrified horse while lightning split the sky, there wasn't time to think, only to feel. His voice trembled at first, a low hum, barely enough to register beneath the howling wind and Dolly's frantic breathing. But he kept going. A simple tune, something old, something safe. His mama used to sing it when he was just a boy, curled up in a narrow bed listening to rain hammer the roof. Swearing monsters lived in the thunder. Dolly's ears twitched. That was the first sign. Her body still tense, muscles tight as wire, but her head tilted just slightly toward the sound. Henry took a breath and leaned into the melody, the words falling from him like he didn't even have to think. "Hush now. The wind won't blow forever. Night won't stay till morning light. Hold on tight and wait for weather. Safe with me. We'll be all right." The tone wasn't perfect. It was coarse and worn, scratched at the edges like gravel over old wood. But it was honest, and it was his. The barn soaked up the sound, warm and aching. Between thunderclaps, it wrapped around them like a blanket neither of them had asked for, but both needed. Dolly let out a long, shuddering exhale. Her eyes were still wide, but she'd stopped trying to run. She stayed close now, her head pressed against his chest, her breaths sinking with the slow rise and fall of his voice. The stall, moments ago filled with chaos, had quieted. Henry closed his eyes as he sang, letting the words carry some of the weight he couldn't say out loud, about the bills, the drought, the empty bed on the other side of the house. Each verse was a confession, each note a crack in the armor he'd worn too long. And just outside, past the creaking barn door, A man stood beneath the eaves, motionless in the dark, listening. The truck rolled to a slow crawl just beyond the split in the road, its headlights dimmed to slits behind a thick sheen of dust. The man behind the wheel sat forward, eyes narrowing as the silhouette of the barn came into view through the gloom. The storm hadn't fully passed. It hung in the air like a held breath, the sky still restless, mumbling thunder like a warning. He cut the engine. The silence that followed was sharp, sudden. He didn't move right away, just sat there with his hands on the wheel, listening. Then came the voice. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It floated through the night like smoke, thin, raw, and beautiful, in the way pain can sometimes be when it's turned inside out. The man opened the door gently, the creak of the hinge sounding too loud against the hush. He stepped out and shut it without a latch, careful not to disrupt the moment unraveling in the barn ahead. His boots crunched the gravel once, then again softer, as he veered off the driveway and into the tall grass along the fence line. The barn was maybe 40 yards out, backlit by the occasional flicker of lightning. He stayed low, hidden in the shadow of an old cedar, heart beating faster than he expected. Not fear, something else. Recognition, maybe. He didn't know the man inside, not personally, but he knew that voice. Or rather, he knew what that kind of voice could do, how it could wrap around a person, strip away the noise of the world, and leave them with nothing but truth. The stranger leaned forward, gripping the top rail of the fence as the song continued. The notes were imperfect, some of them just short of the pitch, but that's what made it stick. It was unpolished, real, like someone who wasn't trying to be heard and somehow made it impossible to stop listening. His throat tightened. He wasn't here for this, not really. He was just passing through. Or at least, that's what he told himself when he took the long way back from Nashville. But something in that barn, something in him, had called him to stop. And now he couldn't move. The song slipped from Henry's mouth like a prayer too familiar to forget, no matter how many years had passed. His voice cracked on the second line, the way it always had when he tried to hold too much in. But he didn't stop. Couldn't. Dolly had stopped shaking, her sides rising and falling in slow, shallow waves. Her ears twitched toward him with each word, and he felt her heartbeat start to fall in time with the rhythm of his own. The lullaby was older than memory, tucked into the corners of his childhood, like the scent of sun-dried sheets and cornbread on Sundays. His mama used to hum it when the power went out during summer storms, rocking him on the porch swing while the wind tried to peel the roof off the house. She never seemed afraid then, maybe because she had a song to carry her through. He hadn't sung it out loud in a long time, not since she passed, not even to Anna. It had always felt too raw, too sacred, like reaching back through time with open hands and empty arms. But here, in the barn, soaked with the smell of hay and sweat and fear, it came back like it had never left. Close your eyes and count the stars. Mama's near, no matter how far. The sky might roar, the trees might bend, but I'll be right here till the storm's at end. He could feel it rising inside him, soft at first, then stronger. Not just the song, but the memory of her hand on his head, her voice, thin but unwavering, the way she'd whisper, "You're all right now, baby. I got you." He used to believe her, with everything he had. The thunder rumbled again, distant now, fading. Dolly gave a low, exhausted huff and rested her head against his shoulder, her whole body slack. The worst had passed, for her at least. Henry leaned his head against her neck, breath heavy. His chest burned, not from exertion, but from something older. A wound time never quite managed to close. He sang the last line slow, barely louder than a whisper. "Hold on, darling, don't let go. There's love in the quiet, more than you know." And outside, in the hush that followed, someone unseen wiped their eyes with the back of their hand. The rain finally came, not in violent sheets like it had threatened all night, but in a slow, steady hush, like the sky had exhaled. It tapped gently on the barn's tin roof, soft enough to soothe, but loud enough to fill the empty spaces between Henry's breaths. He kept one hand on Dolly's neck, his fingers moving in slow, circular strokes along the curve just below her ear. She didn't flinch now. She didn't tremble. Her body leaned against his like a tired child finding sleep in her father's arms. Henry stayed quiet. The song had run its course, and he didn't have another in him. He was wrung out, hollowed in that strange, aching way that came after holding on too tightly for too long. Dolly's sides rose and fell against his chest, her breathing still heavy but steady. Each inhale steadied something in him, too. He glanced up at the rafters, watching the dust fall in the dim light as the rain cooled the barn's air. His back ached from the strain, his knees stiff from crouching too long on the hard floor. But he didn't move. Not yet. Not while she needed him there. Outside, the world had shifted, the wind had died, and the trees no longer clawed at the roof like they were trying to escape. The kind of peace that followed a storm, uneasy, fragile, but real enough to make a man pause. Dolly gave a soft snort and nudged her muzzle into the crook of Henry's shoulder, her breath warm against his neck. He smiled, barely, but it was there. "You're all right now, girl," he murmured. His voice was rasped raw from singing, from worry. "We made it." And in that quiet moment, something broke loose in him, not loud, not even visible, but it moved deep under the surface, like thawing ground after a long winter. He hadn't cried, not when the drought came, not when the bills stacked high, not even at Anna's funeral. But now, with a horse pressed against his chest and the roof dripping rhythm above them, his eyes blurred. He didn't wipe them. He just let it happen. Because some storms don't end until the rain falls. Miles stood frozen beneath the dripping eaves of the old cedar, rain sliding off the brim of his hat and soaking the collar of his jacket. He should have turned around by now, should have walked back to the truck, fired up the engine, and driven off into the black stretch of highway that waited behind him. But he couldn't move, not yet, not after hearing that voice. The song had ended minutes ago, but the sound of it lingered, carved into the night air like smoke from a fire that refused to die. He could still feel it in his chest, in the tight space between memory and regret. The barn had gone quiet again, save for the shifting of hooves and the low murmur of a man comforting his horse. But Miles heard something else under it all, something he hadn't heard in years. Honesty. Not the studio-polished gloss he was used to, not the overproduced radio-ready vocals that lined his inbox day and night. This was raw, unfiltered, like wood before it's sanded, like truth before it's tamed. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder, thumb brushing over the worn button out of habit. He didn't press it. There was nothing to record now. And even if there was, something about this moment felt too sacred to capture, too real to be bottled. Miles had found singers in every corner of the country, gritty blues players in Memphis, honey-voiced gospel women in Georgia, kids with nothing but an iPhone and a dream. But he hadn't felt something like this in a long, long time. Not since his first year in the business, when he still believed music could save people instead of just selling them. He leaned on the fence rail, rain soaking through his sleeves, and watched the silhouette in the barn one last time. The man had no idea he was being watched, no idea his voice had carried across the field like a rope thrown in the dark. Miles let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "I'll be damned," he whispered to no one. Because he hadn't come here looking for anything. But he'd found something anyway. The coat was older than it should have been, frayed at the cuffs, seams tugged open at the shoulders, one pocket half ripped and hanging by a stubborn thread. Miles had meant to replace it for years, but something about its worn weight felt truer than anything else he owned. It carried miles of road dust, fast food grease, and 1,000 late-night drives with demo tapes playing on loop, most of them forgotten before sunrise. He tugged the collar up against the cold and stared through the falling rain, his mind already slipping backward. There was a time when music wasn't a product, when it wasn't about chart positions or viral clips or how photogenic the singer looked under LED lights. Back then, it was just a guitar, a bar stool, and a voice that could stop a room. He used to sit in the corner of dive bars, drink flat beer, and fall in love with songs that no one else would ever hear. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't even profitable, but it was real. His first artist had been a nobody from East Texas with a crooked smile and a voice that sounded like heartbreak poured over gravel. She never made it past the first album, never played a stage bigger than a high school gym, but Miles remembered every word she ever sang. Because when she opened her mouth, it wasn't just music, it was a lifeline. The kind you grabbed when the world tried to pull you under. He'd chased that sound ever since. Found pieces of it now and then, glimmers, hints, echoes, but never the full thing, not until tonight. Not until that voice in the barn. Miles looked down at his coat again, running his fingers over the tear near the chest. It had split open during a fight with a manager he used to call a friend, back when he still believed in loyalty over numbers. That night ended with broken glass and broken trust, and Miles had kept the coat like a scar, a reminder of the line he'd crossed when he stopped chasing truth and started chasing hits. Now here he was, standing in the rain on a forgotten piece of land, listening to a farmer sing to a scared horse. And for the first time in years, he remembered what it felt like to believe in something without trying to sell it. He gripped the fence tighter. Maybe this was the moment he'd been driving toward all along. The morning sun came late, pushing through a low blanket of mist that clung to the fields like it didn't want to let go. The barn smelled like rain-soaked wood and drying straw, and Henry's shirt clung damp against his back as he hoisted the last flake of hay into Dolly's stall. She stood calm now, chewing slow, her eyes soft in the quiet. Last night felt like it had happened in another life. He wiped his hands on his jeans and stepped outside, stretching his back with a low grunt. The fields shimmered with dew that wouldn't last long. By noon, the heat would rise again, and the dust would take over like always. But for now, the world held its breath. For now, there was still quiet. Back inside the house, the floorboards creaked under his boots, the way they always did. He passed the kitchen table without looking at the pile of bills. Not today. He wasn't ready to reckon with numbers again, just yet. He poured himself a cup of coffee, old and bitter, then wandered into the front room, where sunlight caught dust motes dancing above the mantel. Something caught his eye. He didn't even remember pulling the box down from the attic. Maybe it had come down months ago, maybe longer. But there it sat on the floor beside the old armchair, lid cracked just enough to let a corner of something familiar peek out. He crouched, heart already beating faster, and lifted the lid. Inside were scraps of a life he hadn't touched in years. Sheet music with smudged pencil notes, flyers from county fairs, a broken capo, a pack of rusted strings. And near the top, curled slightly from time and heat, a photo. Henry pulled it out with slow hands. There he was, younger, thinner, eyes wide and naive, a cheap guitar slung across his chest, mouth open mid-song. Anna beside him, laughing, her head tipped back like she didn't have a worry in the world. That photo was from the summer they tried to make it work. Open mic nights, long drives in their beat-up truck, dreams bigger than their bank account. His fingers trembled slightly as he ran them over the edge. That version of him felt like a stranger now, but the look in his eyes, that hope, that fire, it hadn't died. Just buried beneath years of drought, of loss, of getting by. But last night, for the first time in forever, he'd heard that voice again. And it was still his. The smell of fried dough and livestock clung thick to the air, sweet and sour in equal parts. The fairgrounds buzzed with families, kids tugging on their parents' hands, teenagers smoking behind tents, country music bleeding from cheap speakers that barely held a tune. But none of that reached Henry once he stepped onto the stage. It wasn't much of a stage, just a plywood platform set up behind the rodeo ring, the kind of setup where the mic squealed every time someone coughed too close. But when Henry stood there, guitar in hand, the world narrowed to the space between him and the microphone. Everything else, dust, heat, the sun beating down on his back, it all faded. He remembered the weight of the guitar strap across his shoulder, how it pulled slightly to one side because the leather was stretched uneven. He remembered how slick his fingers got from nerves, how he nearly dropped his pick 3 times during sound check. But when the announcer called his name, he walked out anyway. He didn't smile, didn't wave, just nodded once, adjusted the mic, and strummed the first chord. Anna had been sitting on the hood of their truck front row as far as he was concerned, cheering louder than the crowd behind her. She wore his denim jacket, even though it was 80 degrees out, because she said it made her feel lucky. When he caught her eye, she mouthed the words along with him, every line. The song wasn't perfect. His voice cracked on the bridge, and the third verse came out a beat too fast. But it didn't matter. People clapped. Some sang along by the second chorus. A kid near the stage sat down in the dirt just to listen. That was all Henry needed. For those few minutes, he was someone. Not just a farmhand's son with calloused fingers and a voice he'd taught himself to trust. He was a singer, a storyteller, a man with something to say. When the last note faded and he stepped off that stage, Anna had met him with a kiss and a smile that made the whole world feel possible. He hadn't played a stage since. And now, years later, the memory of that day still ached. Not because he failed, but because for a moment he didn't. The knock wasn't loud, just a slow, deliberate thud against the barn door. Once, then again, spaced out like the man behind it, wasn't sure if he wanted to be heard. Henry paused, pitchfork halfway to the straw, breath tightening in his chest. Visitors were rare out here, especially unannounced ones, and especially the morning after a storm. He set the pitchfork down and wiped his hands on his jeans, moving toward the door with a silent caution learned from years of waiting for bad news. When he pulled it open, the light spilled out in a wide, pale arc, and standing just outside it was a man in a weather-beaten coat, water-streaked and dust-caked, like he'd walked through 3 counties to get there. Miles lifted his hand in a small, sheepish wave. "Morning," he said, voice calm but careful. "Didn't mean to startle you." Henry narrowed his eyes. "You lost?" "No, sir," Miles said, clearing his throat. "I was passing through last night. Got caught in the storm. Pulled off the road. I heard—" Henry crossed his arms. "Heard what?" Miles hesitated, then looked past him into the barn where Dolly stood calm, ears twitching at the familiar sound of her owner's voice. "Heard you singing." The air seemed to shift. Not a breeze, not a sound, just tension, tight as a pulled wire. Henry didn't speak. Miles took a breath, stepped forward a little. It was good, real good, not polished, not rehearsed, but something about it felt like the kind of thing people need to hear. Henry's jaw worked. "I wasn't singing for people. I was singing for my horse." Miles gave a small, respectful nod. "Sometimes that's when it's best." Another pause. The wind rustled the trees behind them. Dolly gave a soft snort. "I'm not here to sell anything," Miles added. "Just thought it might be worth introducing myself. Name's Miles Carter. I work in music, Nashville." Henry's eyes didn't soften, but they narrowed with something that wasn't quite suspicion, not yet trust either. "You a scout?" "Sometimes," Miles said quietly. "But last night, I was just a man listening to something I didn't expect." Henry didn't invite him in, but he didn't shut the door either. Miles didn't step inside. He stood just past the threshold, the soles of his boots sunk slightly in the mud that hadn't dried from last night's storm. His coat hung heavy with water, the collar pulled up more out of habit than weather now. Henry stayed in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes unreadable, body language not so much closed off as measured, like a man who'd opened too many doors in his life only to regret most of them. Miles looked over Henry's shoulder toward the stall where Dolly stood, chewing lazily on hay, the way horses do when they feel safe. He nodded toward her. "She looked wild last night," he said quietly. "I saw her through the slats, rearing up, breathing hard, the kind of fear that doesn't break easy." Henry didn't answer. "But then you sang," Miles continued, "and something changed." "She changed. I watched it happen. She didn't just calm down, she gave in. Trusted you. Because of your voice." Henry shifted, just slightly. "You watching my animals now?" "No," Miles said quickly. "I was just trying to find shelter. I didn't plan to hear what I heard." Henry's stare was sharp enough to slice through excuses. Miles let the silence stretch between them before breaking it again. "Look, I've been in this business a long time. Most folks I meet are chasing something. Fame, money, approval from people they'll never meet. They bend themselves out of shape trying to sound a certain way, look a certain way. It's noise." He gestured back toward the stall, toward the barn that still smelled of old straw, and fear turned to calm. "But what I heard last night wasn't noise. It was something else, raw, honest. It didn't come from a place of ambition. It came from need. That voice didn't just soothe that horse, it saved her." Henry's jaw tightened, but something flickered behind his eyes. A crack in the wall, maybe. A shadow of pride, or maybe pain. Hard to tell. Miles took a breath. "You didn't sing to impress anyone, and that's exactly why it mattered." The barn settled around them, no sounds but the soft shifting of hooves and the drip of water from the roof. Miles didn't push further. He didn't need to. The song had already said everything. Henry leaned against the barn door, arms still crossed, shoulders stiff. He listened without interrupting, but the more Miles spoke, the more the lines around Henry's mouth deepened. When the last word settled in the air, that's exactly why it mattered, Henry let out a slow exhale, somewhere between a sigh and a scoff. "I'm no singer," he said flatly, "just a man trying to feed livestock." His tone wasn't harsh, but it was final, like a gate swinging shut. Miles opened his mouth to speak, but Henry cut him off with a raised hand. "You heard me in a moment that wasn't meant for anyone. That song? That wasn't performance. That was survival." He stepped forward now, not aggressive, but solid, like a man who had carried his own weight for too long to let someone else add more. "I sing to calm a horse, not fill arenas. I've got no time for Nashville dreams or slick promises. I've got fences to mend and mouths to feed. That's the truth of it." Miles didn't flinch, but he didn't smile either. "Fair," he said softly, "but truth like that is exactly what people need to hear." Henry shook his head. "People don't want truth, not really. They want polish, hooks, pretty faces, auto-tuned heartbreaks written by 10 different hands. I'm not that, and I've got no interest in pretending I am." There was heat in his voice now, not rage, but weariness, seasoned and worn down to the bone, a kind of tired that didn't come from lack of sleep, but from years of trying to make things work that kept falling apart anyway. He looked past Miles, out to the field, where the morning sun was already climbing too fast for comfort. "You don't know what it's like, trying to keep something alive out here. The land doesn't care about your dreams. The bills don't wait for your big break." Miles nodded slowly, eyes searching Henry's face. "You're right," he said, "but that doesn't mean your voice doesn't matter." Henry didn't respond. He just turned back toward the stall, toward the work waiting for him, and Miles knew not to follow. Not yet. The morning stretched long and hot, the kind of heat that settled into the bones and made the minutes move slower. Henry worked in silence, pitchfork moving with the rhythm of habit, not thought. Miles stayed near the edge of the barn, leaning against a post like he understood not to push too soon. He watched, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning everything, tools nailed crooked to the wall, the sun streaking through gaps in the siding, Dolly chewing quietly in her stall, the man moving through his chores like they were the only things holding him together. When Henry finally set the fork down and wiped his brow, the air between them shifted. "You still here?" Henry muttered, not looking up. Miles smiled faint. "You haven't told me to leave." "I figured you'd take the hint. I've been in studios with bigger egos and colder welcomes," Miles said. He stepped forward now, carefully, like approaching a skittish animal. "But I'm not here to flatter you, or feed you some Nashville line. I want to try something." Henry turned, brow furrowed. "Try what?" Miles reached into the small canvas bag slung over his shoulder and pulled out a handheld field recorder. Slim, battered, professional. He held it up like an offering. "Let me record you. Just your voice. Right here. No pitch correction, no polish. Just what I heard last night." Henry stared at the device like it was some kind of trick. "In the barn," he said, flat. "You won't find better acoustics than old wood and quiet air," Miles said. "Trust me. There's a reason some of the best records came from places nobody expected." Henry glanced at Dolly, then at the beams above. He scratched the back of his neck. "What for?" Miles hesitated, then said, "Because you're the kind of voice people don't forget. And I think it deserves a chance to be heard the way it is, not how someone thinks it should be." Henry didn't say yes, but he didn't walk away either. He reached down, grabbed a hay bale, and sat on it with a sigh. After a long pause, he said, "If I sing, it's not for show. It's for her." Miles nodded. "That's exactly why it matters." And without another word, Henry picked a spot in his memory, closed his eyes, and began to sing. The recorder sat on a wooden crate between them, its tiny red light blinking like a pulse. Miles adjusted it once more, angling the mic toward Henry with the careful reverence of someone handling something fragile. He said nothing as he stepped back, giving space, as if too many words might spook whatever truth was about to come out. Henry sat on a hay bale, elbows resting on his knees, calloused hands folded tight. He looked down, not at Miles, not at the recorder, but somewhere far off, maybe inside himself, maybe back in time. His jaw worked like he was chewing on something that didn't taste right. "This is stupid," he muttered. "No one's here but me," Miles said, calm. "Just sing it like you did last night." "That wasn't singing," Henry said. "That was... I don't even know what that was." Miles gave a small shrug. "Didn't sound like doubt to me." Henry looked up, eyes sharp. "Don't try to sweet-talk me." "I'm not," Miles said simply. "I just know when something's real." A long pause stretched between them. Outside, the wind pushed against the barn's loose siding with a soft rustle. Dolly shifted in her stall, letting out a quiet breath like she was waiting too. Henry finally leaned back and let his hands fall to his thighs. He exhaled through his nose, slow and long, like a man giving in, not to someone else, but to a part of himself he hadn't looked at in years. He looked at the recorder, then at Miles. "One song," he said. "Then you get off my land." Miles nodded once. "Deal." Henry closed his eyes. For a few seconds there was nothing, just barnwood, warm air, and silence. Then his voice broke through it. Soft at first, then steadier. No instruments, no backing track, just Henry and the truth of his voice. Gravel and soul, pain and promise. It wasn't perfect, but it meant something. It filled the barn like a confession, like a prayer no one else was supposed to hear but somehow needed to. And Miles didn't move, didn't speak. He just listened, heart thudding in rhythm with every note. One mic, one shot. But it was more than enough. The second song came without warning. No countdown, no nod. Just Henry, still seated on the hay bale, eyes half-lidded, mouth opening like the words had been sitting just behind his teeth for years, waiting to be let out. This one was different. The first song had been a test, 1 foot in, 1 foot out. But this one came from someplace deeper. It started low, barely above a whisper, like he was afraid the barn might break if he let too much loose too fast. The melody was worn and slow, not from forgetting, but from remembering too much. Each word carried weight, soaked in dust and longing. Miles didn't dare breathe too loudly. He leaned forward slightly, hands still at his sides, as if even reaching for his recorder again might disrupt the delicate magic bleeding out into the barn air. The mic was still on, still blinking, but this was beyond a session. This was Henry shedding skin. The lyrics weren't polished. He stumbled once, repeated a line, changed another like it came to him mid-verse. But the cracks made it better, more human. Like the song wasn't written, it was lived. A story of dry fields, old promises, a woman gone too soon, about loss that sticks to a man's ribs, about staying when leaving would have been easier. There's a hole in the fence and one in my chest, where the wind gets in and won't let me rest. His voice wavered on that line, not out of weakness, because it meant something. His hands curled into fists against his jeans, holding the moment steady while the rest of him cracked open. Dolly shifted in her stall and let out a low whinny, almost like she remembered the storm, remembered the sound that had kept her grounded, and Henry's voice just kept rising. Not in volume, but in presence. He filled the barn not with power, but with truth. With every note, he stopped sounding like a man trying to survive and started sounding like a man telling you how he did. When the final note fell, it didn't fade. It landed, heavy, honest. And Miles knew, without doubt, that nothing about this was accidental. Miles waited until he was back on the road to listen again. The barn was behind him now, nothing but a shape in the rear view, the gravel drive fading into the long stretch of two-lane highway. The recorder sat on the passenger seat, silent, its red light off, but the weight of it pressed heavy on the vinyl like it held something sacred. He didn't play it through the truck speakers. That felt too public, too exposed. Instead, he slipped in his earbuds, turned the volume down low, and pressed play. The song began with the sound of the barn, ambient, imperfect, the rustle of straw, the creak of old wood. Then Henry's voice, raw as cut rope, slid in like it had always belonged in the silence. No production, no arrangement, just that voice and the space around it. Miles closed his eyes for a moment at a red light, letting it hit him all over again, honest, heavy. A sound made not for charts or stages, but for survival. By the time he reached the city line, he already knew who to send it to. That night, in the half-dark of a motel room outside Nashville, Miles plugged his laptop into the wall and uploaded the track. The email was short, just a link and 2 sentences. This isn't your usual, no bells, no shine, but it's the realest thing I've heard in years. He addressed it to a quiet handful of people, no publicists, no agents, just the old guard, the ones who still believed music could matter, the ones who remembered what it sounded like when it wasn't built to sell. He hit send. Then he sat back in the chair and stared at the blank motel wall, the hum of the air conditioner the only sound left. No response came right away, and he didn't expect one, not tonight, maybe not for days. But somewhere in the cloud, that voice, that trembling, rusted, gut-pulled voice, was moving, quiet as a whisper. And sometimes, Miles knew, a whisper was all it took to start a storm. The barn grew quiet again, the kind of quiet that settles after a storm but doesn't feel like peace, more like waiting. Henry kept working like always. Mornings started early with cracked hands and stiff joints, feed, water, fences. The rhythm didn't care about songs or strangers or blinking red lights on little recorders. Life on the farm didn't pause for possibilities. Weeks passed. The days blurred into each other like pages smudged by a wet thumb. Henry didn't talk about the recording, not to the feed store clerk, not to the neighbor who helped patch the north fence, not even to Dolly, who still leaned into him when he hummed under his breath in the evenings. Especially not to himself. He didn't expect anything to come of it. Not really. Every now and then, he'd catch himself glancing toward the road when a truck passed slower than it should, or pausing by the old landline mounted in the kitchen, listening for a ring that never came. He'd shake it off, rub the back of his neck like the heat was bothering him, and get back to work. But the silence wrapped tighter with each day, not cruel, just still, like something had been set in motion and then forgotten. There was no email to check, no phone in his pocket. Henry had never cared for screens or scrolling. But that also meant if something was happening out there, if that voice was moving through hands and headphones and hesitant nods, he wouldn't know. And that uncertainty hung in the corners of his day like cobwebs he couldn't reach. At night, he'd sit on the porch with a chipped mug and listen to the insects hum through the trees. Sometimes he'd pick up his old guitar, the one he hadn't touched since Anna was alive, and let his fingers drift across the strings. No songs, just sound. Something to fill the space. He didn't believe in second chances, not anymore. But sometimes, when the wind blew just right, he wondered if someone out there was listening, and if maybe, just maybe, the silence meant something was coming. Something slow. Something real. The mailbox leaned a little to the left, post-warped from years of wind and rust. The red flag had long faded to a muted pink, chipped at the edges, barely holding on. Henry didn't check it often. Most of what came was junk or bills, and he already had enough of both stacked on the kitchen table like bad habits. But that morning, something felt off. Dolly had been restless, pacing in her stall at dawn, ears twitching like she'd heard something he hadn't. The kind of nervous energy that made Henry glance over his shoulder for no reason. The sky was clear, the sun just beginning to rise over the far edge of the field. Still, his gut itched with something that wasn't quite fear, but not hope either. He walked the gravel drive with his coffee mug still in hand, boots crunching with each step. When he opened the mailbox, he expected the usual, flyers, an overdue notice, maybe another threat from the power company. But sitting right on top, stark against the white envelope clutter, was a thick cream-colored envelope, heavy stock, embossed return address, Nashville. Henry froze. He stared at it, the steam from his mug curling into the morning air, unmoving. For a second he didn't reach in, just looked at it like it might vanish if he blinked too fast. Then, slowly, he pulled it out. His name was written in actual ink, not printed, not stamped, the kind of careful handwriting that meant someone wanted this to be taken seriously. Back in the house, he sat at the table and stared at the envelope a while longer, before finally sliding a knife under the flap. He pulled out the letter, unfolded it with deliberate hands, and read. They wanted him in Nashville, studio session, full production. A real chance, an official demo, potential label backing. They called his voice a rare, authentic resonance, and undeniably raw. They called him an artist. An invitation was attached, flight information, accommodations. A quiet note at the end from a producer who signed it simply, "Thanks for reminding us what this is all about." Henry set the letter down, heart pounding. Outside, the wind shifted through the trees, and for the first time in a long while, it didn't sound like loss. It sounded like beginning. Henry sat on the edge of the porch with the letter folded in his lap, corners soft from how many times he'd opened and closed it. The sun was setting low behind the trees, throwing long shadows across the field, golden light stretching over the dry rows like a promise too big to believe. Crickets had started their chorus, and somewhere down by the fence, a lone bird called out, sharp, insistent. But Henry didn't move. He held the paper like it was something alive, something that could bite if he held it wrong. Nashville, a real studio, a real shot, words that didn't belong in his world anymore, not with a barn roof sagging, a field still gasping for rain, and bills packed so tight in the junk drawer they barely shut. He shook his head, slow, like it might clear the fog building behind his eyes. He hadn't wanted this, not like this, not again. What would Mama say? He muttered aloud, voice thick. She'd believed in him once, back when belief was all he had. She'd sit at the kitchen table with a cigarette burning too low and hum along while he strummed old songs on a second-hand guitar. "You got a story in that voice, Henry," she'd say. "You just got to learn how to tell it." But that was before the farm passed to him, before Anna got sick, before singing became something he did only in the dark, only to ease the fear out of trembling bones and spooked horses. Now the story in his voice felt tangled in all the things he'd failed to save. He looked out at the barn, at Dolly's silhouette in the fading light. The air smelled like hay and dust, and the weight of too many years. Going meant leaving everything, if only for a while. It meant chasing something he'd buried, deep enough to forget how much it used to matter. But staying meant more of the same. Henry rubbed the back of his neck and looked down at the letter again. "What if it's too late?" he whispered. But the wind didn't answer. Only the sound of the crickets and the faint echo of a song he hadn't finished singing. The folding chairs were set up in neat, merciless rows. A makeshift canopy flapped in the breeze, and the auctioneer's mic crackled with static as he tested it, his voice too loud for such a quiet morning. Pickup trucks lined the edge of the property like vultures, men leaning against their hoods, sipping coffee, murmuring about irrigation lines and equipment. Henry stood off to the side, arms crossed, a ball of acid twisting in his gut. The farm didn't look like much to most folks. Fences sagged. The barn needed a new roof. But to Henry, it was marrow and memory. Every inch of that dirt had been walked by people who shared his blood. Every broken-down tool in the shed had a story. And now it was being tagged for sale. The bank had been patient. More patient than most would have been. But patience doesn't pay the note, and Henry had run out of time. He'd watched them come that morning with stickers and clipboards. They labeled the tractor, the hay baler, even the rocking chair on the porch. Dolly was safe. He'd already made arrangements for her with a neighbor up the road. That was the one thing he wouldn't compromise. But everything else? It was going. He pulled the letter from his back pocket, unfolded it again. The words hadn't changed. Nashville was still waiting. The plane ticket was still valid. The offer still stood. Miles had called that morning too, told him it wasn't just a demo anymore. The song was moving, fast. People were talking. Henry folded the letter again and slid it back into his pocket. The auctioneer called for quiet. People started moving toward the chairs, and Henry turned away. He walked back toward the house, slow, steady, like the ground might shift beneath him. Inside, he didn't grab a bag, didn't take a souvenir, just reached for the guitar case he hadn't touched in years. He stood in the doorway for a long minute, looking out at the land that had raised him, broken him, and still, somehow, taught him how to hold on. Then he closed the door behind him. Sometimes letting go is the only way to carry something forward. The morning felt heavier than it should have, not because of the clouds, there weren't any, but because of what had to be done. Henry led Dolly by the reins, the old mare walking slow beside him, hooves pressing into the dirt with a reluctant rhythm. The air was still, no birdsong, just the quiet crunch of gravel under boots and the occasional swish of her tail. She didn't know yet, not really. But animals sense things. And Dolly had always been a little too smart for her own good. The neighbor's place was a mile up the road, tucked behind a windbreak of tall pines. Earl had been a friend of Henry's father, old-school rancher. Kept to himself, but showed up when it mattered. He'd offered to keep Dolly the moment Henry mentioned needing help. No questions asked, just a firm nod, and she'll be safe here. Henry appreciated that kind of talk. No fuss, no pity, just action. They reached the gate, and Earl was already out front, leaning on the fence post, a feed bucket in one hand, and a soft look in his eyes that didn't quite match the rest of him. Henry didn't say much, just handed off the reins, gave Dolly a final scratch between the ears. She leaned into it. "Be good, girl," he murmured. "Don't give Earl hell." She huffed like she understood, then turned away without a fight. That was the part that stung the most. Earl didn't say goodbye. He just nodded once and led her toward the pasture, his boots dragging slow. Henry watched until they disappeared around the side of the barn. An hour later, he stood at the bus stop outside the diner on Route 12, guitar case at his feet, ticket in his shirt pocket, and the weight of the farm still sitting on his shoulders like it had followed him off the land. The bus came into view, rumbling down the road like a promise he wasn't sure he believed in yet. He picked up the case, stepped forward, and climbed aboard. As the bus pulled away, Henry didn't look back. Some goodbyes are too big for one glance. The studio didn't look like much from the outside, just a squat brick building wedged between a taco joint and a pawn shop on the edge of Nashville. But inside, it was something else entirely. Clean walls, cold floors, and silence so thick it felt like stepping into a church where no one believed in God, but still showed up to pray. Henry followed Miles through the narrow hallway, the soft hum of machines and muffled voices drifting behind closed doors. Everything smelled like coffee and dustless plastic, the air too cold from the overworked AC. He kept one hand on the guitar case like it might anchor him, the other stuffed in his pocket, fingers curled tight around the paper with the song lyrics, though he already knew them by heart. They led him into a sound booth with glass walls and too many buttons. A tech with bleached hair and sleeve tattoos nodded politely, motioning to the mic stand. Someone else adjusted the levels behind the glass, and a red light blinked to life over the door. Miles offered a reassuring clap to the shoulder. "Just like in the barn," he said. "You don't need to do anything but tell the truth." Henry swallowed. The truth. That's all he had, and right now, it didn't feel like enough. The headphones were tight over his ears. He could hear the faint hiss of the room through the mic, every shift of his feet, every breath. It was too clean, too exposed. Nothing like the barn, where the sound soaked into wood and air and memory. His throat felt dry. He strummed the first chord hand stiff. The sound bounced back too fast, too polished. He froze. The silence that followed made the room feel smaller. Through the glass, Miles gave him a thumbs up, as if that would fix whatever was cracking inside his chest. Henry looked down, closed his eyes. Don't perform, just sing. He took a breath, thought of Dolly's heartbeat under his hand, the weight of Anna's laugh, the sound of his mama humming by the window while beans simmered on the stove. Then he sang. And little by little, the fear bled into the song, and the truth came pouring out. The headphones gripped his ears like hands that didn't belong to him. But Henry didn't flinch this time. He kept his eyes shut, let the silence press in until it almost hurt. On the other side of the glass, engineers and producers leaned in, waiting. But their presence fell away the moment he let his mind drift home. He imagined the barn, the scent of hay, the soft shuffle of Dolly's hooves, the way her body trembled under his hand that night, until the sound of his voice reached whatever place inside her fear was living. And he imagined his mama sitting in that worn kitchen chair, apron tied loose around her waist, a wooden spoon tapping rhythm against the rim of a pot, humming that same old tune like it was stitched into her bones. That was all he needed. He adjusted the guitar on his lap, fingers sliding into place without thought, just memory. The red light blinked above the glass again, but it might as well have been a firefly in a distant field. It didn't matter. The world had shrunk to the space between his chest and the microphone. Then he began. His voice was lower than usual, not because he meant it to be, but because that's where the song lived, in the soft underbelly of grief and gratitude. He didn't sing it for the radio or the crowd, or the men in leather chairs scribbling notes. He sang it for the ones who wouldn't hear it but still needed to, for Dolly, who listened with the purest kind of trust, for his mama, who taught him that music didn't have to be perfect to mean something. Even when the lights go down, even when the fields run dry, I hear you in the quiet now, like a whisper through the sky. His voice broke halfway through the second verse. He didn't stop, just kept going, letting the break carry, not hide, letting it mean something. When the final chord faded, he opened his eyes. No one said a word in the control room. but they didn't have to. Henry had sung like they were both right there, and somehow, in that moment, they were. It started quiet, the way most storms do. One post. A grainy clip from the studio. A minute and 30 seconds of Henry, eyes shut, singing like the world outside didn't exist. No filters, no production tricks, just the old guitar, his raw voice, and a caption that read, "The farmer who sang his horse calm during a storm." Miles didn't plan the timing. He didn't pay for ads. He just hit upload one night and let it go. By morning, it had 10,000 views. By the next day, 100,000. And then it caught fire. The comments came in like a flood. People saying the song reminded them of their father's voice, their mother's cooking, their childhood porch. People who hadn't cried in years crying in their cars on the way to work. Strangers writing long confessions in the replies, about grief, about silence, about holding on through the storm. A woman from Nebraska said she played it for her son with autism, and it was the only thing that stopped his shaking during a thunderclap. A man from West Virginia said he hadn't spoken to his brother in a decade, but they both shared the song on the same day. Some called it country, others said it wasn't. But nobody could deny it was real. Henry didn't have social media. He didn't even know how to check a view count. It was Miles who told him over the phone, voice buzzing with something like disbelief. "You're not just going viral," he said. "You're cutting through. That song, it's waking people up." Henry sat on the edge of the hotel bed, staring at the muted TV. He rubbed his hands together, slow, unsure what to do with the idea that his voice, his old, tired, cracked voice, was echoing into thousands of homes. He thought about Dolly, about the barn, about singing in the dark with nothing but fear and faith in his lungs. He never meant to go viral. He just meant to make it through the night. And somehow, that was enough for the world to listen. The bus groaned to a stop just past the bend in the gravel road, tires spitting dust into the morning light. Henry stepped off slow, guitar case in one hand, the other clutching the strap of the worn duffel over his shoulder. The air smelled like home, sun-baked dirt, cut grass, the faintest hint of something blooming early. It hit him hard, that scent, like time hadn't passed at all. But everything had changed. He walked the familiar path toward the house, boots dragging just a little, not from fatigue but reverence. The barn came into view first, paint more peeled than he remembered, the roof still bearing the dent from last year's windstorm. He smiled at it like an old friend. The door creaked the same way it always had when he pushed it open, and the smell of hay and sweat rushed up to meet him. Dolly was there, head lifting, ears perking, her eyes catching his in that same soft way that said, "I remember you." He dropped the duffel and crossed the floor to her, pressing his forehead to hers, his breath catching without warning. "Told you I'd be back," he whispered. She let out a long, low sigh, then nudged his chest like she was calling him a liar, and forgiving him at the same time. The deal had been signed in a glass-paneled office 3 stories above a street full of people who'd never touched a horse. The kind of room where men in buttoned shirts talked numbers and tour plans. But Miles had kept it grounded, said Henry's voice didn't need dressing up, just space to be what it was. The check had cleared. The farm, his farm, was no longer sinking. The lights had been kept on. The land was his again. But none of that hit him as hard as standing there in the stall. Dolly's warmth against him. The silence around them, not empty, but earned. Henry set the guitar case down on a bale and opened it. He didn't tune, didn't warm up, just sat in the dust and played something soft, not for the crowd this time, for the barn, for the past, for her, and for himself. The sun hung low over the edge of the pasture, casting everything in the kind of golden haze that made even broken fence posts look like art. The light filtered through the slats in the barn wall, painting streaks across the dirt floor where dust danced slow and lazy in the still air. Henry sat with his back against the same stall where it all began, guitar across his lap, boots planted in straw. Dolly stood close, her muzzle just inches from his knee. She wasn't anxious. No tremble in her muscles, no wide-eyed fear, just calm, steady, present. Her eyes met his with the kind of quiet knowing that doesn't need words. She remembered, same as he did. He strummed a chord, soft and low, just enough to stir the air. No crowd, no cameras, no blinking red lights. Just her, just him, just the light and the silence between notes. He started to sing. The words weren't from any studio track. They weren't the polished lines someone else wrote to fit a hook. These came slow, unfolding, like a letter never sent. A melody born from everything he didn't say when things were breaking and everything he wanted to say now that things had begun to heal. You stood by when the sky fell down, never ran, never turned around. When I had nothing but empty hands, you leaned in like you still understand. His voice didn't try to be more than it was. It cracked once, faltered slightly on a high note, but he didn't fix it, didn't want to. The imperfections were the truest part. Dolly stepped closer and lowered her head to his shoulder, eyes closed. Her breath came slow and even, her body relaxed in full trust. Outside, the last of the sun spilled across the field like a final promise, soft, quiet, full of something you don't get twice. Henry played until the light faded and the air cooled. Not because he needed to, because he wanted to, because she was listening, and for once the world wasn't asking him to be anything more than exactly who he was.